you're good to go, Douglas.
Right, thank you. So I guess official welcome to everybody to this session, which is Reimagining Doctoral Writing Down Under, and it's a book launch. So I am Douglas Eacersall. I'm from the University of Southern Queensland here in Toowoomba. And the other main facilitator today is James Burford from the University of Warwick. So to get us started, and I'll just get James, if you can click through the next slide, we'll just start off just with an acknowledgement of First Peoples. So we acknowledge the custodians of the lands and waterways where we are located. Further, we acknowledge the cultural diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay respect to elders past, present and future. We celebrate the continuous living cultures of First Australians and acknowledge the important contributions Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have and continue to make in Australian society. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And of course, that was specific for me here in Australia. So we also acknowledge the Indigenous custodians from wherever you may be located today, and welcome you to acknowledge them also, if you'd like to, by commenting in the chat. So this next slide here is, we thought we'd just give a little bit of an introduction to the series of events. So this event is part of a series. It's the first one for 2022 for the International Doctoral Research Network, IDERN. And there are 4 other events that we do have planned for this year coming up. So there's one on effect and doctoral education, that should be in May or June, one on doctoral career trajectories in July or August, one on doctoral wellbeing and excellence in September, October-ish, and then the final one for the year on doctoral journeys in November. So please look out for further information coming out about the specifics of these. And they'll come out through the IDERN listserv, which if you aren't a member already, if you just email IDERN, that email there at mun.ca, you'll be able to pick up the details there, and they'll also be put on Eventbrite as well. So hopefully this first event in the series is kind of going to kick things off for the year, and then we'll have those further 4 events investigating lots of the interesting things around doctoral education, doctoral research in that area. So I'll hand over now to Jamie, who'll be running the next section as we then move into the other bits of the program.
Awesome, thanks Douglas. Hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this event. Which, whoops, let me just figure myself out, which is celebrating the publication of Reimagining Doctoral Writing, edited by myself, Cecile Badenhorst and Britt Amell, who are both based in Canada and won't be joining us today given the time zone challenges. So this book was released in late 2021 and was published by the WAC Clearinghouse Online Open Access and in print, formed by the University of Colorado Press. And perhaps more importantly, this event today is to celebrate the fabulous work from contributors to the book who are based in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. So you might wonder why we're having a special event focused on Australian and New Zealand doctoral writing scholars. And in response, I'll say that in a book with 13 chapters, we had 6 involving contributors from Down Under, and we figured that this was something to mark and to celebrate. So if I just, are you still seeing my screen? Maybe you're not. No, okay, let me just share it with you. All right, so here is a little bit of a preview of the book. So as you can see, we have 13 chapters, and we're lucky enough to have 4 of the contributors in the book speaking today. Across the 13 chapters, you can see we have sections on what the call is to reimagine doctoral writing, colleagues who are exploring concepts and tensions within doctoral writing, colleagues who are reimagining doctoral writers and their others, and then what it might mean to write a reimagined doctoral thesis. So this is how the book has sort of come together. And this is what it looks like in terms of the front cover, which was, oh, I'm just gonna put some folks on mute if that's okay. All right. So yeah, and this is what it looks like in terms of the front cover, which was actually designed by Cecile, who is one of the co-editors of the book. So yeah, in terms of the book, we were really excited to have gathered insights of contributors writing from both New Zealand and Australia, but also Bangladesh and Japan, South Africa, Denmark, the UK, Canada, and the US. And we hope that interested readers can dip into particular chapters in order to consider how national policy contexts might shape possible routes for reimagining doctoral writing. Alternatively, readers can consider the book as a whole in order to compare accounts across these contexts. So what I was hoping to do today was to start by talking a little bit about the origin of the collection and what we hope to achieve within it. And then I'll come to a kind of outline of today's events and introduce our order of speakers today. So in terms of the book, in 2018, my co-editors, Britt and Cecile, edited a special issue of Studies in Discourse and Writing, which is also freely available in open access. And the special issue is titled Visual Strategies in Play, Visual Strategies and Innovative Approaches to Graduate Writing. And I was one of the authors who had written a piece for that special issue. And so the three of us connected. And we began, as lots of things do, with small conversations that led to bigger conversations. And we initially planned to edit a book, which was a sort of version of the special issue on innovative approaches to doctoral writing pedagogy. But as we talked further, we began to become more drawn to the idea of reimagining. Perhaps we saw it as an opportunity to examine doctoral writing beyond the how-to, where much of our own practice has also occurred. And I think one of the things we wanted to do in coming to the idea of reimagining was to shift the focus from an instrumental or pragmatic approach, where we often take for granted what doctoral writing is or might be, and then proceed on that basis to generalize about knowledge about doctoral writing in one context or another. So the title Reimagining Doctoral Writing reflects our belief that a questioning stance might be helpful about what doctoral writing might be. And while there's a clear demand for practical advice, we also think there are other ways that ought to be nurtured around thinking about doctoral writing too. So I guess just to sort of give a little bit more context around the book, we began with an understanding that doctoral writing and writers are always in flux and under pressure. There are inevitable calls to conserve and protect some ideas and practices, and to reform or innovate and abandon others. And in recent years, questions about how we imagine doctoral writing have arisen to prominence because of significant contextual shifts within doctoral education more broadly. So, you know, a lot of these things will be known by colleagues in the Zoom, but I guess we're talking here about the increasing internationalization of doctoral writing, doctoral education, particularly in the Anglophone global north. We're talking about the ways that doctoral graduates have been repositioned, often as future knowledge workers, the ways that doctoral education as a practice is increasingly subject to audit and oversight from national and provincial governments. All of these shifts have reshaped how the doctoral student has been imagined, and in turn how writing and writers might be conceived. And as editors, we felt that this changing context of doctoral writing sort of positions it as a pressure point, because the practice of writing is so fundamental to the production of research and researchers. It's always entangled with broader doctoral education concerns. So in this collection, what we hope to do was to open up the system, as Julia Molinari argues in her chapter in the volume, We wanted to encourage contributors to offer different tools and approaches that might open up our ideas of what doctoral writing might be and how it might be researched. And while we were open to historical studies that tracked how imaginings of doctoral writing and writers have changed over time, we also sought to uncover what new doctoral writing imaginings might have arisen in the 21st century, as well as why they might have arisen and what their impacts might be. So when we sent out the call for abstracts for consideration for the book, we received 70 proposals in a variety of national contexts. And while we were unable to accept all of the abstracts, we were really encouraged to see so many colleagues interested in reimagining doctoral writing, including lots of interest from current doctoral students themselves who were also doing doctoral research in the area of doctoral education. So we turned down many potentially excellent chapters, unfortunately, but we tried to have a wide representation of countries of origin and approaches to the topic. And while it's going to be up to Kelly and the chapter authors to speak to the contribution and thoughts that emerge from the book in greater detail, I think I'll just say that the title of the book includes the word reimagining with a hyphen, quite deliberately. That the hyphen between reimagining is meaningful. It acts as a bridge that encouraged authors to locate dominant imaginings of doctoral writing at the same time as they seek to construct new ones. So across the collection, the most significant imaginings we could trace are the idea of the competitive, individualized, and disembodied doctoral writer. Other dominant imaginings of doctoral writing that we saw travel through the collection are images of doctoral text as highly disciplined and normative. And another key imaginary that became clear across the collection is one that sees doctoral writing through a colonizing or colonized gaze. With this knowledge, it probably won't surprise you that some of the reimaginings articulated by the authors signal a clear shift away from the idea of the autonomous and individualized author, with writers in the collection offering rich reimaginings of doctoral writing that configure it as embodied, affective, and relational. And other reimaginings present across the chapter are decolonial and subaltern imaginings, where authors discuss or demonstrate examples of how doctoral writers can animate diverse epistemologies and languages. So in order to flesh out some of these reimaginings, authors across this collection have offered innovative conceptual tools and paths of inquiry to think with. We've had queer concepts, feminist concepts, new materialisms, and we hope that, across the collection, we've succeeded in unsettling any attempt to take doctoral writing and the doctoral writer for granted. I think that the authors have revealed that imaginings of doctoral writing and writers are contested, and that they've argued that doctoral writing matters for students, their supervisors, our institutions, and our world. So today, we're really fortunate to have 4 speakers presenting, each of whom will have around about 8 to 10 minutes to present some work from their chapters. Oops, let me share my little screen there. So we have, here are our speakers today. So we've got Stephen Thurlow from the University of Melbourne. We've got David Veitapui from the University of Waikato. We've got Louise Ravelli from University of New South Wales, and we've got Catherine Mitchell from Unitec Institute of Technology. They will be our 4 chapter speakers today, who will each be sharing a slice of their work, which we're really lucky to have you and super grateful for your presentations. Then we're also very lucky to have our discussant, Kelly Guerin from the Australian National University. Whoops, does it help if I spell university? And Kelly will be engaging with the chapter authors' work and also, I guess, pushing us forward in terms of key questions that we might want to be asking as we research and make sense of doctoral writing as an area of research. We'll take questions at the end, folks. We'll have plenty of time for questions, I hope. And the hashtags that we'll use for this event, if any of you are active on Twitter, will be hashtag IDERN and hashtag reimagining.ri. So I think I've probably spoken enough and given you enough of an introduction to the book. I'm really excited now to ask Stephen to share his presentation. Stephen, I will be keeping time and I'll let you know once your 10 minutes is up.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to everyone coming along today. And yes, I'll attempt to speak to time. I've just got a couple of PowerPoint slides I'd like to share. So yes, I've got an interesting topic, and it turned out to be a very interesting chapter, I think, for the book. So yes, I was looking at arts doctoral writing, and I was looking at the topic of creativity and how that was expressed or suppressed in arts doctoral writing. I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So creativity in doctoral writing is quite a big topic, but a slightly hidden topic, I'd say. Slightly puzzling. I've called it an enigma there. So it's a word which tends to go over many different fields, many different interpretations. I call it a little bit of a buzzword. It does get thrown around a lot. At university, in university context, it can have a more practical application, and it's often used synonymously with the term innovation. I like Tardy's definition there, creativity as tied to the idea of imaginative effort subject to expert judgment. And of course, the doctorate is a lot about judgment or assessment. Creativity is unmentioned in thesis assessment criteria, although originality is, which I feel like they are very close cousins. Other terms that come up, I've talked about innovation, but also this word novelty or newness, and also originality. But I was particularly interested in creativity and looking at it in the context of doctoral writing in arts, so the Faculty of Arts. So I'm a doctoral student. I'm coming towards the end of my degree, and I looked at creativity through a couple of different lenses here and different stages of my research. So stage one, I looked at 11 doctoral writers, both multilingual and L1 writers, and I looked at what they understood by this term creativity. So this was an exploratory stage. Stage two, I went to some academic supervisors in arts, 6 of them, and I looked at their understandings of creativity, both what it is and what it could be. From their perspective. And stage three, I traced 4 of the multilingual doctoral writers in the Faculty of Arts and their changing perceptions of creativity. So that's the one I'm going to focus on today. So I looked at the different paths, multi-doctoral writers, and I was particularly interested in using the ideas of Sarah Ahmed, particularly her motif of paths and path making. So I found her work particularly useful for looking into doctoral writing and the topic of creativity. So she identifies queer use as deviation from a straight path of doctoral writing into a more ill-used or uncertain terrain. So once doctoral writers contemplate or actually leave a standard path of doctoral writing, I found that this could lead writers into a situation where they could creatively queer their work. So I'm using queer as a verb there after Britzman. So in doctoral writing context, I found this creative querying could reside in either the ideas or the content. So it could come in the realm of ideas or in the expression or form of these ideas. And I found that manifestations of creativity may be admired and indeed celebrated for their novelty, or they may be spotted and removed by an academic reader as a transgression of some standard, a disciplinary standard or another standard to do with academic writing. I did find that doctoral writers who persevere with a creative or an unconventional path face some struggles, including self-censorship and a degree of resistance from their readers, which I found quite interesting. And just a couple of observations from that last stage of my research. So yes, it does take significant effort to creatively queer a thesis. Two of the female writers I looked at, although they were initially activity and creative practices, ultimately felt quite reluctant to save part of how the doctorate should look and sound. So they didn't persevere with creativity in their final thesis product. However, one male writer, I found he subtly remade his doctorate possible in his work and including crumbs of creativity. So even very small things in his writing, he felt were immensely creative, and possibly these elements of his writing would be overlooked by a casual reader, but possibly the disciplinary reader would pick them up. So basically his examiner or supervisor. So often this journey towards creativity or away from creativity often occurs after a critical incident. I found often a troubling event that occurs some way along the candidature leads to creativity or leads to turning away from creativity. So just as a final comment here, a little bit of a comment about pedagogy or imagined pedagogy or reimagined pedagogy. So I found that creativity is often hidden away in doctoral writing pedagogy. It's not out in the open. So I feel like we need to discuss more about this taboo term. So candidates to supervisors, supervisors to supervisors, etc. We need to talk about this term more often. Writing workshops or writing focus workshops on creativity would be beneficial, and these should be safe spaces where participants could openly discuss this topic and maybe how to move into a more creative approach. So drawing up students' creativity, originality, and potential for innovation could be an aspect also of supervisor training. So look, that's really all I had time for today. So yes, thank you. And I hope you learned something about creativity in doctoral writing context today. Thanks for listening.
Amazing. Thanks, Stephen. What a brilliant presentation and a brilliant chapter that I'd highly encourage people to read. Really, really interesting to hear. You presented again. Thank you. I believe our next presenter is going to be Dave. Over to you.
Hello, Peter JB.
Hi, Dave. Your green is coming through. I can see it really clearly. So over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa, malo rerei, whalawalahi atu, and a warm Pacific greetings to you all. I acknowledge the Kingi Tuheitia, Pōtatau Te Wherowhero. I acknowledge tangata whenua of this land, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I acknowledge all of you who have taken up your time to come along tonight and listen to us. My name is David Whaavai. I am ancestrally linked to Tonga, Samoa, and also my placenta, my whanua, is in Niue. That's where I was born. When Margaret Kovach, who was of Indigenous Nehiwa and Solidor ancestry from Saskatchewan, Canada, attended the University of Regina in 1984, she described post-secondary education as becoming a portal of self-discovery. In Kovach's own words, exploring identity unleashes anger that I thought I had worked through. It also evokes a lot of sadness, though that was always there. In my mind, identity and education always intersect. Through the chapter in the book, Reimagining Doctoral Writing, it provided a portal of self-discovery for me, enabling a move to reclaim my Tongan identity. Writing in Lea Whakatonga, Tongan vernacular, led to a discovery of decolonial potential that provided me a time, place, and space to scribe ngahi se tesi, moi palakalafi, sentences and paragraphs into white pages that traditionally privileged dominant Western text. The visual, the image, the slide you see on the screen captures the central ideas and practices articulated in my chapter. They represent the ways in which I actioned decolonial potential through doctoral writing, in form and intention. My chapter focused on the reimagining of doctoral being and becoming through the concepts of wā and Veitapui, Tongan notions grounded in Indigenous Pacific philosophies linked to relational and sacred spaces. As articulated by Māori scholar Carl Mika, Indigenous philosophies take on a worlded stance, where entities such as the land, ocean, and sky, for instance, shape the process of how one comes to know oneself, and as such are intimate parts of one's world and consequent worldviews. Through an Indigenous worlded philosophy, wā, VA, with the macron, can also be used to understand the space in between, in which people relate to and make sense of their ideas and concepts. Such interrelations are believed to be spiritual and sacred in nature, like the concept of Veitapui, which I unpacked in my chapter, as well as epistemological, because all things in the world are relational and intricately connected. Doctoral writing, as understood within wā and Veitapui, provided a critical space for me to legitimize and value Indigenous Pacific thought in relation to dominant Western knowledge. William Churchward defined wā as the distance between distance apart. Figuratively, wā relates to the relational space or interrelations between people, as well as between people and perceived inanimate objects, such as the land, ocean, trees, and sky. In my chapter, I employed Talatalanoa practice, ongoing critical conversation, interrogation, inviting Tongan and Indigenous students and scholars to engage in the space of ongoing discussion about the ways in which we can appropriately draw from our ancestral knowledges and collaborate with each other to make sense of and honor our knowledge and language within academia. At the same time, this discourse will allow a wider audience to consider and appreciate what it means to live and work with, knowledge systems that are outside of their own. The hyphen was used as a technical and symbolic vehicle for implementing VA, Veitapui, and Talatalanoa to capture their decolonial potential within doctoral writing. Through doctoral learning and writing, the encounters and experiences strengthened and affirmed my whatongia, a responsibility to honour and safeguard Tongan cultural knowledge. Engaging in my own doctoral writing project was a matter of socio-political struggle and epistemic disobedience, because the academic traditions linked to perceived proper writing conventions were not what I adhered to in my own doctoral writing. Va, Veitapui, Talatalanoa, and the hyphen aided me in uncovering time spaces within decolonial practice and the reimagining of our Tongan ideas, language, and practices could be represented, expressed, and articulated through writing. Ngā mihi toa whaka.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate your presentation and a really beautiful account of a really, really important chapter in the collection. And yeah, we were thrilled that you submitted your abstract and wrote it for the book. A really beautiful piece. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversations that will flow in the Q&A to come, folks. So please save up your questions. Our next speaker is Louise. Are you ready to present, Louise?
Yes.
Is
Is that sharing now?
Yes, it is. Perfect. But we can see your notes, just FYI. Perfect. That's looking great.
Better? Okay,
Yep.
great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, James. And hi, everyone. And I'm speaking also on behalf of Sue Starfield and Brian Poltridge, my colleagues. And I'm speaking from Wangaland in what is also called Burford in Sydney. So our chapter is called Reimagining Doctoral Writing through the Visual and Performing Arts. So this is reporting on a study which we actually did 10 years ago. And this study examined creative practice doctoral theses. So these are doctoral theses in the creative and performing arts that have an explicitly creative work, in inverted commas, because we all know that all research is creative, but a performed, visualized, musical, dramatized, installed creative work that is part of the thesis, along with a written component. And so the common denominator in these doctorates is the production by the student of both a creative work of some kind and a written text. And both pieces of work are evaluated as part of the doctoral examination process. And the two together are typically referred to as the thesis. So this came out of a 3-year ARC funded study in 2008 to 2010, which was conceived and led by Brian and Sue. And while the work is now more than a decade old, we still feel it's necessary to make the case that these are legitimate forms of research and have as much a right to a place in the academy as any more conventional thesis. So I'll begin by just showing you some images of extracts from these theses that we examined, and I won't comment while I'm showing these images. So I'll just pause on that one there. As you can see, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. the theses are very much incredibly diverse, and a large part of our project was simply gathering examples of these theses, which was not an easy undertaking at all. Brian and Sue travelled all over the country to find the physical copies of these theses, and also to find all of the theses, because sometimes they were in disparate parts and they weren't always obviously tied together. So just gathering the examples was a really important part of our project. And we observed enormous variation in the nature of these theses. Of course, there's immense variation in the institutional practices in terms of the requirements for the length of the written component, how the written and creative components are examined. Immense variation in the form or presentation of the written component. For example, whether a conventional or more contemporary font is used, whether it's white paper, A4, a portrait set up from Officeworks, or whether it's an artistic paper with a different texture and materiality, whether or not there are images, if so, what kind of images, whether there might be actual material objects within the thesis, or perhaps the thesis is presented within another material object, such as a box or a case. There was immense variation in terms of how the written and creative practices, again, both of those in inverted commas, were interrelated from actually no relation, so two really separate works, to a fully merged kind of work where the writing and in these cases visualizations were so fully entangled that you couldn't tease them apart. Immense variation in the kind of authorial voice that was used, from the conventional, academic and impersonal to a really inventive poetic voice. And these differences might be seen across different theses, where a particular thesis would have one voice that dominated, or within a thesis where an author might use multiple voices within the bounds of their own thesis. And these theses also varied in their macro structures, so the way the chapters were organised, from a conventional, reasonably familiar, like introduction, methods, results, discussion kind of layout, to a loose topic-based approach. And they varied in length, perhaps from 35 pages to half a page, and that half a page might have been a picture rather than any writing. So incredibly varied. So this variation is perhaps one of the reasons that the creativity here is viewed as Stephen said, somewhat suspectly, because it doesn't fit into neat conventions. And if you come from a different perspective, it's not always easy to understand how it operates as research. But using some ideas from Carl Maton on legitimation code theory, came to the conclusion that these theses are embedded within disciplines that preference Noah codes. So the Noah code is characterized by diversity in its objects of study, and or by diversity in its approaches to study. So these are weak epistemic relations, and weak not being a negative there, just being a marker of the potential for diversity there. And the Noah code is also marked by the privileging of experiential knowledge and an appropriate voice, which arises from strong social relations. So the foregrounding of the individual is permitted. So many topics may be legitimately pursued using a variety of approaches, and the subjectivity of the author is highly valued. And so it's in the very nature of the field, or the fields, the various creative and performing arts disciplines, to be constantly reinventing and reimagining ways to do visual and performing arts research. So hence these theses can all look extremely different. And that can create discomfort for the academy, knowing, you know, where to fit them in, as I think many other authors have described in relation to other aspects of doctoral writing, as David just did with his own experience of positioning himself within the academy. But what we also found alongside this variation is a high degree of unity underlying this, in a way, surface variation. So the written component had to be more than just description to be a thesis. So we only collected theses that were successful, that had been examined, had passed, and most of them had been recommended by their supervisors. So the written component has to be more than just description. It must also motivate the study in personal and or artistic and or theoretical terms. It must situate the practice in an ongoing practical and or theoretical tradition, engage with theoretical discussions relevant to the practice, and argue how the practice contributes to the relevant practical and or theoretical and or personal trajectory. And so there are just a few key underlying rhetorical functions underpinning all the surface variation: the research warrant, research capacity, research evidence, and research effectiveness. So these rhetorical functions might appear in different sections of the thesis, might be realized through writing or through image or through the creative work and so on. But nevertheless, they are there and they are evident. And the structure of the thesis can also be radically reconfigured so long as the underlying rhetorical functions are still met. And this liberates the written component of the thesis from structural straitjackets and allows the candidate to be more experimental. So an analogy or a comparison I like to make to demonstrate like the underlying research functions is with a television show, So You Think You Can Dance, which was around about a decade ago when we were undertaking this research. So it's a dance competition, and invariably dancers were very skilled and excellent, but presenting extremely familiar forms of dance. Whereas in the School of the Arts and Media, where I work and where we teach dance as well, the work that the students produce there is quite different. And we can see, you know, it being an expression of research and of, you know, expressing the validity of the research within the bounds of that discipline. So some of the main conclusions that we came to were that academic writing courses need to allow for more open approaches, as open as the approach to creative practice and research itself. And that institutional guidelines must also allow for the production of the written component to manifest diversity and creativity as much as the so-called creative component. And of course, we all know that guidelines and regulations, be they from within the institution or from without, are always about creating compliance and easily recognizable forms and so on. But what we actually need is the reverse of that. And I'm pleased to say that in my school, you know, a lot of our findings have been adopted in adaptations of our guidelines for creative practice theses. And we also need successful prior models and multiple instances thereof, and the value of that can't be underestimated. It's the availability of multiple examples which has the most powerful effect on the confidence of students to tackle doctoral writing in their own way, less burdened by received conventions of what a thesis should be. By showing students how others have successfully reimagined the doctoral writing process, it opens up the space for them to develop their own meaning-making potential. And I'll just finish with my favourite quote from one of the theses which we had as an exemplar, Berridge, Repicturing My Life, and she was working on an autobiography, and she says, writing autobiography is like trying to cram a large jellyfish into a jam jar. Squeeze one part into the jar and other floppy parts bulge out from the edges. Long jellied trails escape, tentacles cling obstinately to the outside of the jar. And she goes on. And I think trying to characterize creative practice theses is a little bit like trying to squeeze them into a jam jar as well. And for institutional practices, for supervisors, for students, we don't want jellyfish in jam jars. We want them to be able to swim. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louise. What a beautiful place to leave us, and a beautiful image that I have floating in my mind. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you to you and your colleagues for such a beautiful chapter. Really encourage colleagues to read it. So our final chapter author speaker for this morning, afternoon, evening is Kat Mitchell. Kat, are you ready?
Kia ora, Jamie.
Kia ora.
Can you hear me?
Can do.
All right, I'll just share my screen. Let me know if you don't see any slides in front of you.
I can see that.
Wonderful. I'll just show the screen. Please.
Awesome.
So excellent. Kia ora koutou mā, ko Kat Mitchell tōku ingoa, no taranaki ahau, kei te mihi, kia koe Jamie, ko IDERN hoki, e mahi ana au ki te Ngāwaia, te Tui, Māori and Indigenous Research Centre. So I'm Kat and I work in a kaupapa Māori Research Centre. And in this presentation, I am reflecting on some of my earlier work that really explores and thinks about the place of the writer in students' kind of on doctoral aspirations. So I won't spend too long on it. I'm very aware of time, and the last time I timed my presentation, it was 9 minutes and 50 seconds. So, so I need to not say too much, but just first generation students within doctoral education. And as I said, it was particularly focused on the ways in which students imagined the university, doctoral education, and their aspirations for study. So, and one of the things that I became really interested in was the ways in which neoliberal discourse configured students' aspirations for their studies, did or did not really. And so my analysis identified, as might be expected, an array of neoliberal conceptions within student accounts. Certainly within the study, the willingness to invest a significant amount of time and energy in doctoral education was undoubtedly tied to students' employment aspirations, with the goal of many to get a good job, particularly a good academic job, which was commonly mentioned as one of the sort of first hoped for outcomes of doctoral study. And I think in my study it was about 2/3 of the first generation students articulated that desire. So there were other ways in which kind of neoliberal ideas or imperatives emerged in their conversation. Students spoke about the goal of getting a good job, in some instances with direct reference to economic rewards. And one international student, said in relation to finances, you're going to secure a good job, you're going to be able to get money in terms of undertaking her doctoral work. Another student called Linda articulated the neoliberal imperatives for her doctoral study in quite a different and striking way, where she describes being forced to do doctoral study to upgrade the profile of her university. So her comments alluding to the pressures of in the international higher education market, and how in her Asian context, her institution was keenly focused on raising their academic standing through staff possessing higher qualifications and increased research outputs. This kind of neoliberal framing of the sort of purposes and possibilities associated with doctoral education was also articulated with reference to a desire to be excellent, a concept which sometimes was framed strongly in terms of a competitive drive to be high achievers and top students, which can be seen as kind of aligning with neoliberal individualistic and competitive orientations. But alongside these kind of aspirations, it was also notable that students spoke of their investments in doctoral studies in a variety of ways, many of which did not easily or neatly conform to neoliberal perspectives. Katie, another student, spoke of her undertaking doctoral studies as being a necessary work requirement for her to maintain her academic position, yet she did not sort of talk much beyond that requirement, and instead reflected on her early imaginings of the university and some of the famous writers who inspired her interest in higher study. So I've got a couple of quotes here that I just want to skim over. And in the first one, we can see how Katie talked about her love of storytelling, her experience of reading the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and in her mind, these University of Oxford professors and well-known English literature figures embodied the university when she was young in her thinking. And this reflection on the characters, the idea of professors in a kind of gentleman's club, I imagine, and the hobbits all kind of gathering with them is definitely a sort of fantasy world that is invoked, where writer academics mingle with their characters into a realm of old-fashioned clubs and privilege from times long past. Her comments also accord with the notion that being an academic within the university simply means also being a writer. And the significance of the place of writers further emerged in her account, where Katie discussed her engagement with the idea of the university as a place for writers. As she says, I became aware that to be a writer, there were different things you had to go through to learn how to write and where the appropriate places to learn how to write might be. So Tolkien and Lewis lived in a university, in my mind. In her words, the university is a kind of special place, one that allows someone to become a writer in the company of others with similar interests and commitments. In this view, it is possible to find some coziness in her account, where the university is a place where the life of the mind may be nurtured and appreciated. And as she later commented on her aspirations for her doctoral thesis, she spoke of the goal to prepare a writerly text, one that creates a powerful, effective response in its readers. It was her hope that her thesis would be something stunning that will capture the hearts of people and move them. So, as Thompson and Kamler maintain, writing is integral to the identity of a scholar. In simple terms, scholars are expected to write and to write particular kinds of text. Thus, if one seeks to become a scholar or academic by an alternative name, one needs to take up the writing project as a means of identifying oneself with a particular scholarly identity. And this writerly identity, which is so identifiable in Katie's words, appears for some in this study to be especially significant impetus for taking up doctoral work. And the question may be, why is this important? Why is this kind of capturing of the kinds of different investments in the idea of the doctorate and the project of writing the thesis be important to think about? And of course, one might argue that in an environment that is increasingly dominated by neoliberal imperatives, it's important to find ways that people still understand the work that they do, the passion for their work, and the different ways they conceptualize it as being not completely captured by neoliberal orthodoxies. And Katie was not alone in her articulation of these varied ways of seeing the doctoral experience. And although I, can't talk about them at length in this presentation, there were really sort of powerful examples of the ways in which Indigenous students, or a particular Indigenous student that I think about at the moment, sort of reframed her understandings of the university, grounding it in a particular Indigenous worldview. There were also within this study an African student who strongly understood the PhD project as being deeply implicated within the work of their family, within the work of the community, and as being very collectively oriented. So for all of these reasons, it's valuable to explore the different kinds of conceptual resources that are available to us, whilst not necessarily advocating for any kind of golden past that was in its own way extreme. And perhaps the ivory tower sort of invocations in the words of Katie, the student that I've talked about this evening. So I just want to finish on a kind of last note that in this study, it was clear to me that the university and doctoral education was understood, or continues to be understood and imagined in rich ways. And it demonstrates that in spite of the impacts of neoliberalism, the identity of the scholar and the practice of scholarship remain tangled in writing. So,
thank you, Kat. Thank you very much for your presentation. Beautiful work, and a beautiful PowerPoint too. I had fantasies of sort of tapping away on those typewriters as you were presenting. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate you sharing your work. So that's our 4 chapter authors who have shared their presentations so far. We're really honoured and fortunate to have our colleague Kelly Guerin, who's here and who's going to act as a discussant in order to sort of push some of our thinking forward. So over to you, Kelly. Really looking forward to hearing your reflections.
Thank you. And I don't have a beautiful set of slides. I'm just going to talk about the things that I've been listening to and reading about. So you can look at each other's faces while you're listening here. So which gives us a really lovely sense of the community that we're working with. But also, thank you very much, Jamie and Douglas, for getting the IDERN program underway for 2022. It's really a joy to be in this space again. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this session and giving me the opportunity to reread these papers in a bit more detail than I did when they first appeared. There's such a treasure trove of valuable insights into how we can be much more adventurous in doctoral writing. And I really love hearing the authors talking about their own work and the things that you've chosen to focus on in this discussion. So I guess my opportunity here is to think about all 4 papers as a group rather than trying to pick out particular details in each to unpack. But there's kind of 3 main ideas I'd really like to talk about that I've been thinking about since reading those papers. And the first one really is trying to consider the difference between doctoral writing and how that's actually quite different from research writing. So these are the kind of 2 terms that I find myself working with these days. And one of the ideas that comes through these chapters is the recognition that there are all sorts of constraints on doctoral writing because it has to meet certain criteria in order to meet those examiner expectations. And so that's one of the big challenges I think that we're facing. So I really like the way that Louise's work points to the variety and adaptation that's possible within the broad framework of a thesis. Those conventions of the IMRAD structure, the introduction, materials, methods, results, analysis, discussion and conclusions, those conventions direct examiners to the broad structure of what actually seems to constitute research. So it's those rhetorical functions that examiners need to see in order to understand that this is research, and especially when you're pushing the boundaries, helping the examiner for a doctoral thesis to see that you are able to show what is the state of knowledge in the field that you're exploring, that you have identified what the new knowledge is that you're seeking, and also how you went about finding it. So those, I think that's one of the big differences. And when you're writing a chapter for a book like this, you get to do different kinds of things from if you're trying to write a thesis for examination. And as you've already alluded to, lots of disciplines in the humanities, for example, have shaped those elements into different configurations to better articulate the content. So that IMRAD structure is a kind of conventional science shape for a thesis, obviously. But when you look at the tables of contents from humanities, arts areas, you see those variations on the basic structure. And things like including a preface that positions the researcher in relation to the material, which is something that you wouldn't see in the conventional shape, or chapters that follow an argument across the whole thesis rather than breaking it up into the other parts of the IMRAD structure. But still, we're demonstrating those rhetorical functions that Louise was talking about. So I really enjoyed reading Stephen's chapter that explores the risks of delivering some more creative document for examination. And the way he reminds us that even small diversions from that safe path can feel very challenging for doctoral writers. As you were talking this evening, I was thinking about how on the one hand, we do that experimenting with the writing as we're learning to understand the topic or the research, the concepts, those sorts of things. So that it's actually, experiments in the writing are really important for learning, I think. But then remembering this is high stakes writing. There's a lot to win or to lose along the way. And so I was thinking about how it's sort of necessary at the beginning to understand what the established conventions of doctoral writing are, before we can make deliberate, informed decisions about disrupting those conventions and the possible meanings that might be attributed to those deviations. So successfully finding that balance between these degrees of knowingness is liberatingly creative, but readers need to know, is the author aware of what they're doing, or is this just some kind of mistake because they didn't really get it? You know, so that, I think that's part of what we're up against. As Thurlow says, it's risky. That we need to be really careful about what it is that the doctoral writer is trying to communicate to the reader. And of course, this writing is about communication. So it's really thinking about that reader, I think, is actually important in doctoral writing, in any writing, but especially in this area. I particularly like Stephen's comparison when there was the, I think it was the first doctoral candidate who was talking about that makes a distinction between being the artist and the artisan. So the artist is the one who's experimenting with the writing and trying to, you know, being creative. It's the artisan who crafts the final document. And I think keeping these two images in play might make doctoral work much more fun for both the candidate and for the supervisors. I think one of the things that we start to notice then is how creativity is more often demonstrated in the thinking and the creation of new knowledge and ideas, rather than that creativity appearing in the writing itself a lot of the time, or in the way that that creation is being expressed. So it's a kind of delicate and nuanced task to do both of those kinds of creativity simultaneously, and particularly once you start to step outside the humanities and arts disciplines. So to me, whilst I was reading these chapters, it seemed like there's a really compelling tension here that we're working with. On the one hand, enrolling in a PhD and, you know, wanting to expect the rewards that are offered by the academy, that's sort of one on one hand. So that's what Kat's imaginaries of that description of the scholar writer that I found very beautiful when I was reading it. On the one hand, we have that image of, you know, people wanting that life that the academy appears to offer. And then on the other hand, seeking to dismantle the elitism and privilege of the academy, or at least to push the academy into new territory by pushing the boundaries of disciplinary knowledge and how that knowledge is represented. So, for example, the way that we see David's insertion of Tongan language and ideas into the thesis text gives us a really helpful example of how this kind of decolonising boundary pushing can be achieved while also meeting the expectations of how research needs to be expressed. So it's kind of I can see there's things going on in the chat, but I can't read that at the same time. So if some of that is saying, oh my God, what is she talking about? I'm happy to engage with that afterwards as well. But as Stephen's participant learns, the system won't change to accommodate the writing. And I think that's one of the things that we're really working with in this space. To me, it seems a little bit like the way that abstract painters first refine their skills as representational painters. In a similar kind of way, scholars still need to demonstrate that they can perform the task according to the conventional expectations, almost like earning your credentials before the work is able to push boundaries and sort of being taken seriously as legitimate research and scholarship. I think that's part of the legitimation code theory that Louise was talking about. So there's ways in which we need to show we know what we're talking about, we know what we're doing in this space when it's doctoral writing as opposed to other kinds of research writing. And obviously that's galling for people who are extremely experienced in their field of study and they know what they're talking about and they know exactly why they're doing it. But when it comes to a doctoral thesis, we're still up against this idea of examination and the examination criteria. So I think this kind of goes to the heart of what is the purpose of the PhD and doctoral writing. So who and what is this university degree for? And remembering that we, those of us in the Zoom room, are the academy. We're part of it. So, of course, all research doesn't have to happen inside the academy. All sorts of research can be done elsewhere. So I'm really trying to think about what doctoral writing is in this space. And it makes us think a lot about the reader, I think. So is this writing for the author, which is, perfectly reasonable, that's fine to do that, or is this writing meant for the reader? And I guess I'm coming at this partly from the supervisor's perspective. I'm thinking about what is it that we need to do to prepare examiners to understand what they're assessing as well. So for me, it sometimes becomes a question then of how far can we push doctoral writing, and where does it become a bit too much for the genre that we're trying to work with? So these, I think the ideas that are raised in these chapters really help us focus in on some of those quite challenging questions. And there's so much I want to talk about. I know I'm racing through. But one of the things I really enjoyed in these chapters was the range of theoretical lenses that have been used to underpin the research and help us understand what is that's going on in doctoral writing. So from Louise's legitimation code theory, that helps us notice who's allowed to know about research and therefore who's allowed to talk about it and be listened to. Kat's work drawing on Barnett's ideas of imaginings, helping us to understand how our shared social fantasies about the figure of the scholar in the university, how that shapes our expectations about what individuals are going to get out of their thesis writing and their PhD. As I was reading that, I was thinking that it might also help us understand why so many PhD graduates feel kind of cheated when they don't end up with that perfectly satisfying full-time academic job in their first choice university. That it can feel like an intense betrayal sometimes, I think, that recognition that it's not perhaps what they imagined at the beginning. David's work on the Indigenous perspective that helps us focus on time and space through those concepts of Va and Veitapui invite us to notice the interconnected nature of research and learning that sits in this web of relationships between the researcher, colleagues, and community across time. I think that provides us a wonderfully stark contrast with the competition and individualism of the neoliberal ethos that was uncovered in Kat's paper. So I'm really fascinated by the ways in which motivations to take up doctoral studies tune into historical images of the scholar-writer and of the privilege that that's believed to entail. So that Kat's chapter gives us this really powerful images of how compelling that fantasy is of what doing a PhD looks like. And I really like the way that neoliberal university riffs off the older idea of the small L liberal intellectual, how that's still very much in play. And I love seeing that set alongside David's chapter that's invoking Indigenous perspectives on scholarly writing by integrating Tongan language into the English language text so that it unsettles our expectations and reminds us in a really pointed way about the alternative ways of being and doing that sit outside those conventions of academic research. There's also that stuff about voice in doctoral writing, and as a kind of an aside, what happens when you put an oral tradition up alongside a written tradition, and how do we engage with that? I think that's one of the kind of fascinations here. And then Stephen queers all of this space to introduce further insights into how research creativity is represented in doctoral writing. So Ahmed's concepts of lines and directions, routes and paths, orientation and disorientation uncover the ways in which doctoral writing is bounded. That helps us understand also the costs of risking another path that may not be understood by readers, and by readers I'm thinking examiners for the doctoral thesis. So while I was reading that, Stephen, I kept humming to myself. Some of you may know that old Johnny Cash song about I Walk the Line. If any of you don't know it, here's a link to it. But that idea of we might go to the edges of the path we're on, but we're still trying to stay within the boundaries of that path. And I think that's a really useful way of trying to understand how far can you push it, how far do you need to meet expectations to get the degree. So I've got just a couple more minutes. So the third thing I'd really like to draw attention to is that we see that this collection is doing really, really important, and I find quite exciting work actually that's being undertaken in education and social sciences more generally. So this work that's identifying possibilities for doctoral writing that address some of those wider concerns and developments in thinking that traditional theses fail to allow for. So Louise's work draws our attention to the varied forms that doctoral writing can take when finding ways to represent creative practice research. I find that really inspiring. And we see, to see how meaning is created in the actual presentation of the ideas. So playing with the font, it was lovely to see those images in front of us this evening. So playing with the font, including handwriting, using special coloured papers for the hard copy, including images and even objects. And then also David's discussion of the hyphen. And Jamie, you referred to this at the beginning also in relation to the title of the collection, that the way that the hyphen both connects and identifies an isolating in-between space reveals that so what it shows us is that the actual written version of the research carries richly nuanced meaning in how it looks. So the meaning is much more than the words on the page and the argument that's articulated. And so when I'm thinking about this, I'm also finding myself wondering, how do we take those lessons into STEM disciplines, into hard sciences? If we want to take next steps into extending what doctoral writing can do, because I don't really think we can just talk about doctoral writing in humanities, arts and social sciences. We need to, I think about this as a kind of a concept that goes across disciplines. So I'm kind of hoping that these chapters might pave the way to opening up more adventurous thesis writing in the sciences as well. I'm not really sure how, but perhaps it might be that it allows for greater engagement with the assumptions underlying who research is for, or for example, what should be valued in doctoral research, or what the role of the researcher is in lab-based experimental context. So as a fairly obvious starting place, I guess, research into health issues for Indigenous communities would greatly benefit from those sort of questions, becoming an expected part of the thesis as a kind of researcher positioning statement, for example, that we would often see in social sciences theses. When David refers to voice and the pronouns that are used to position doctoral writers in relation to the context of their research, to the content of their research, we see how important that notion of academic writing as somehow neutral and value-free has been eroded in social sciences pretty generally, I would say, at this point. But it can potentially do much the same in hard sciences, I would have thought. So pushing into those areas, I think, would be really interesting and challenging, but I think we could get some really amazing research and research communication coming out of those sorts of doctoral theses. So I'll leave it there, but overall, the kind of richness of these 4 chapters reminds us of how much there is to understand in this doctoral writing space, and also how we can continue to push the boundaries as we reimagine what doctoral writing can do. I'm really keen to hear from the rest of you what else you've got to say about it, or what your other questions and things might be. Thank you. Now I can read your comments and see if you thought that was all completely crazy.
Thanks, Kelly. It was such a gift. Thank you so much for such a generous reading of each of the chapters. I've read these chapters many times and I've learned new things from hearing your engagement with them, and it's given me lots to think about. So thank you very, very much. It was brilliant. Colleagues, we've got just under 10 minutes now for Q&A. We've got all of our speakers are here and we're really keen to hear your questions. I know there have been lots of comments popping up in the chat, so feel free to reiterate those if you'd like to put them into your own voice. So please just raise your hand, or let me know if you'd like to ask a question, or also feel free to put it into the chat if you're not in a position to voice it yourself. Any questions, folks? I'll give you just a couple of minutes. If no one has a question to start us off, I'm very happy to ask one. So I'd like to ask a question to Louise, actually. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you managed to gather the kinds of theses that you gathered. Like, what was the process that you went into to find these theses that had pushed at these edges in this way?
Thanks. So Brian and Sue might want to jump in here, and please feel free to do so if I report this incorrectly. So we had a number of stages, including surveys of supervisors and doctoral candidates as well. You know, were there creative practice theses in their departments? Were there successful models and so on? And Brian and Sue travelled to numerous universities to interview both supervisors and candidates, some of whom graduated, who had graduated, and to find out their thoughts. So our approach was a textographic one, sort of a textually oriented ethnography, which a lot of people would be familiar with from John Swale's work. And it was a lot more work on the ground than simply, you know, looking up a thesis repository in you know, the central database of those theses, because they you know, if it's been presented in sorry, some motorbike dog, we're all familiar with that. Yeah, so you know, physically they can be hard to locate and hard to find all of them. You know, we were some way through the project before we realized that one particular thesis, that its creative component and its written component were actually related. We couldn't actually see any interconnection between them. So that was really interesting to find that out. So yeah, it was a lot of legwork on the ground, and particularly from Brian and Sue. So if they would like to elaborate on that, please do so.
Oh, Brian, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, Sue and I are doing another project at the moment, looking at kind of the history of the PhD and what's happening kind of now. And this builds on what Louise has just said about, and your question you asked about how hard it is to find sample texts, actually. We looked at theses submitted in the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, different sorts of areas. And then we're doing follow-up interviews now. You know, it's true, some of them are really hard to find. You can't just go to university library and throw in a word and think it's going to pop up. There's all sorts of strategies you've got to use for doing them. You know, sometimes asking other people who've done this work how they found them and things like that. But I'll just say one small thing. And one thing we noticed when we were doing the visual arts one, we went to a roundtable meeting in Melbourne at the VCA, and people were saying, why do we have to write? And people have said this, can't we just have a visual project that's a doctoral piece of work? And everyone in the room saying, yes, yes, yes. But of course, there isn't an academy in Australia that would accept that. But we've found in this current work that we're doing at the University of Toronto, if you're doing a Doctor of Musical Arts and Composition, your thesis is the score that you're submitting. And the examiners read that. There might be some contextual notes, but it's not a thesis in the sense in which we conceive it. Yet the performance strand, which Sue's done more work on, there is a thesis, but there's no obvious connection, I think you said, Sue, between the actual series of recitals that they do. There may be, but it's not like an explication of the recital. So what is the writing is kind of a curious thing, especially when you get into these ones, which is a composition. Of course, that's writing, but you know, it's a completely different kind of piece of writing to the text, which is about swing violin, for example, is one of the ones that we came across. So yes, to answer that question, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to get the text.
But if I can just comment, because I'm sitting at my desk all morning looking for online versions of theses, particularly in the creative and performing arts and music, where nowadays it is so much easier to find the creative component, but not always. So there are places where, and there are people who are uploading their creative performances, and one can easily find them on ProQuest or some institutional database, the university library, and there's others where you can't find it at all. So we are still kind of stuck in that, but definitely, and quite a number of the theses that we've looked at in the written component will say, you know, my portfolio of creative work is on a CD in the back pocket of the hardcover. So we know we're never going to be able to find that when it's a library somewhere else in the world. But they are, as somebody said, slowly starting to move out of the appendix. So that's the new affordance of the digital that is coming. And it's interesting in terms of, I've been also doing a little bit of work looking at so-called alternative dissertations or multimodal theses, and I've been collecting those. And that is really interesting, I think, as we see the creative practice thesis kind of morphing into the humanities and these very multimodal, some of you've probably seen them, these new types of dissertations where they are very visual, they integrate the visual and the written. There's some that are entirely web-based, where there isn't one pathway into the thesis anymore in that chapter structure. And there's multiple entryways and, for example, interviews with people on our video clips. So I think Louise's point about exemplars is really important, that the more we can help students and supervisors see these instantiations of new kinds of so-called alternative theses, the more they can perhaps change can be brought about through this way. It's only through seeing what's possible and being, you know, developing a way of thinking and talking about it.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Brian. Really valuable reflections for any colleagues who are thinking of going in search of theses like this. Alistair, I think we've got time for a quick question from you, if you could.
Yes.
Quick.
Okay. It was, okay, the second bit of it then, it was picking up from something that Stephen had kicked off with when he was talking about creativity, and then Callie articulated it much better than I was thinking about the idea of the relationship between creativity and creating, and the creativity being in the construction of ideas rather than in the construction of the thesis, the writing itself of the thesis. That's much more to do with creation as opposed to the creativity aspect. And then we have overlaying that whole notion of creativity in writing and what's permissible within the boundaries of the disciplinary norms, which of course we're trying to get through the examiner who comes from that sort of a background, and in all probability is not bringing to it the sort of nuances that people who are immersed in doctoral education, doctoral writing as a discipline that they or we would bring to it. So I think there are that sort of issues around that, but thinking about it in terms of creation, create, and creativity is possibly another way of broaching the subject.
Awesome. Thank you, Alistair. Those are
or maybe just even creativities, plural, could be one way of doing that. Just a comment.
Yeah, no.
Thanks, Stephen. Folks, I'm aware we're sort of coming close to time, unfortunately, but I'm happy to, I'd love to have a chance to hear from Kat and Dave if you have any sort of parting reflections from if you have any, no pressure to have any, from the kind of presentations we've had today, or anything that's sort of come to mind for you. Kat, did you have any reflections you'd like to share?
Really just wanting to acknowledge the richness of the conversations and discussion. I enjoyed everyone's presentation, and indeed your sort of guiding us into the presentations tonight, and sort of Kelly's wonderful, thoughtful sort of analysis and generous kind of comments about the writing. So I guess beyond that, I don't have too much more to say, but and I will say one thing. Thank you for those beautiful images. They were just stunning. And, you know, I think that, you know, the two presentations on creativity, there's something really nourishing about that for those of us interested in doctoral education, and to expand our thinking around what what an excellent or what a passing PhD can be is actually really inspiring. So I'll just stop there. Kia koutou.
Thanks, Kat. Dave, I wondered if you had any parting reflections.
Yeah, a short one, Jamie. I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you and the team just for, again, as Kat mentioned, the generosity and sort of enabling us to push beyond the safety or the safe path that Kelly talked about. One comment that the editorial team gave was, you can write paragraphs in Tongan language. That to me just opened up so many possibilities. And I'm wondering whether doctoral education and doctoral writing, because we'll be honest, doctoral writing is a privilege. Writing is a privilege. It's a tool that only the few can use and implement. And doctoral education itself is a privileged experience. Not many get to do it. And I just want to acknowledge that, Jamie, just for activating, I think, sort of voice, just with those comments that you guys gave. And I hope that the next generation of Indigenous Pacific scholars coming through can feel
Thank you, Dave.
the same way.
Thank you. A really beautiful place for us to leave it, I think. So yeah, on behalf of those of us on the IDERN committee, there are a number of us here. There's myself, Marie's here. Hi Marie, lovely to see you. Douglas, of course, who has been really helpful in dropping the link. So please do drop the link. Please do fill in the survey link. Douglas, did you want to offer any parting reflections?
Nothing too much. I mean, it was just, I guess, a privilege to listen to everybody and then the things that they had to say, expounding those chapters. And I know I've already had a little bit of a look at the book, but this has certainly encouraged me to go and back and have another, I guess, dip into some of those different chapters, etc. So yeah, thanks for the people who presented, and also thanks to the people who attended today and all of the input that we had. There was quite a lot going on in the chat that I think was really productive too. So thank you, everybody. And just again, if you could fill in that survey, that would be wonderful. It is just a short survey of an evaluation of the session, so we can improve the ones that are coming up as well. So that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Lovely to have you gathered with us this morning, afternoon, evening. Yeah, really look forward to seeing you at upcoming IDERN events. Take care, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Buddy.
Bye.
Thank you.